I don't think I've made a video about this truck yet. This is an 85 GMC Jimmy. It's basically a K5 Blazer just with GM badging. So, when I got it, I was told the engine was rebuilt. I do believe that. There's a chrome oil pan, there's a different intake. The wiring is cleaned up. It's not OEM, so I do think it does have a different engine. But when I got it, it was really running really rich. It was pumping a lot of smoke out the exhaust pipe on startup, and it had like a rich stumble upon acceleration. So I replaced the carburetor. It had an old Brock. It's got a Collie right now. I didn't film that. It's under the air cleaner. Really, it's very simple. You've got the PCV valve up in the front vacuum line. You have this on the side over here, the skinnier line on the front of the Holly. This goes to the vacuum advance for the distributor. You've got an electric choke, and in the back you have vacuum for the brake booster, which is hooked up, and that's really it. All the other vacuum lines on this Edelbrock Performer intake have been plugged off. So the only thing that I'm gonna mention and talk about, the reason I'm making this video, is I went to fire it up. These Holly carbs, they come pre-set out of the box to run. Now I'm at high altitude, the Denver area, so probably not tuned specifically for this altitude, but they do run out of the box just fine. Now I fired it up and got a really high idle. I didn't actually check it, but I would guess somewhere 15 to 2000 RPMs idle. And I noticed one of two things. Basically, if you have a high idle like that right on start, it could be a lot of things, but if your carb is adjusted properly, it could be your electric choke, or your choke isn't working. If it's a vacuum, most likely it's electric. Typically, you don't have these little alligator clips here. All that you have is a little wire coming out of your wiring harness that goes to the positive on the electric choke. The negative terminal typically routes back to the carburetor, and it usually grounds out through the casting on the carburetor and the intake. Now this is an aftermarket intake, it's aluminum, so that right there wouldn't work out. You're not gonna ground through aluminum. So the first thing I did was I put the alligator clip on the negative and I tied it back to the battery just to ground that out, but it didn't do anything. So I got my multimeter and I hooked up the black one to the negative and the red to the positive, and I noticed I didn't have 12 volts. I didn't have power going to the choke. So at that point, I realized this wire right here coming out of the harness wasn't supplying 12 volts to the electric choke. So then I got the red alligator clipped and I basically jumped the positive from the electric choke to the positive on the battery, and the negative on the choke to the negative on the battery. And that eventually brought the idle down to where it should be, like 750 idling. So we're gonna go through and diagnose that. Now, one of the things on these older vehicles, it's kind of weird and it's kind of funky, but this circuit for the choke, it actually runs through your choke, the choke bulb on the inside of the dash. So if you come in here, follow me real quick. I'll actually show you, because I've got two of these trucks. I have an 84 and this is an 85. Right over here on the right hand side, this should be an orange bulb that says choke. When you turn it over to ignition, the choke should come on. And it doesn't on this truck. I'll show you that when I get the key, and on another truck I'll show you what it actually does. So hang tight. Okay, so key in. Hear that? Ooh, 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 ooh. It's nice. Tickles my biscuits. So watch right here, right? Nothing. Fasten seatbelt comes on. The brake light does work as well, but we should be seeing a choke light. So this one, the bulb is burned out. Let's go to my other truck. Okay, so this is a different truck. You see the choke comes on. That choke bulb is working. You've got power to the electric choke. So that's all I wanted to show you. Now basically the deal with that is the choke circuit that sends power, that power to the choke is downstream from that bulb in your dash. For whatever reason, if that bulb goes out, you're not going to get continuity through that circuit, and it's not going to send 12 volts to your actual electric choke. So I'm going to go in, pull this dash apart, and I'll replace the bulb on the back side and see what's going on over there, and then hopefully we'll get 12 volts downstream from that coming out of that positive end of that wiring harness And then from there, we just still gotta run a wire from the negative side to ground out our electric choke because the aluminum intake is never gonna ground. So let's pull the dash apart and then fix that. So we're back here. This is the back side of the gauge. Here's the main electrical connection. It just plugs right in here. This was plugged into this slot. This is your check engine light. This doesn't appear to be burned out, seems fine. And as suspected, the choke right here, there's nothing. There was nothing in there. It's completely missing. So off the top of my head, I don't know if it's just like one of these other bulbs. The way the backside of these guys work in a lot of these older vehicles, it's just these little, you twist them lefty-loosey. This one looks burnt out too. But they come right out, basically. They're little guys like this. And then you slide them back in and you twist it righty-tighty. And this whole circuit board paper on the backside, all these copper connections, these are basically wires that run to certain areas, and it connects your positive and your negative, and it makes your lights work when they're supposed to. So I don't know if the choke is supposed to be just a little plug-in guy like this, or if it's supposed to be an actual thing with wiring like this. I kind of suspect that. I'm gonna root around on the back side of these wires and see if I see a loose connection, something that looks like this, that's just not hooked up. If I don't find anything, I'm gonna take a bulb like, say this. Man, these things are so dusty. I'm gonna take a bulb like one of these, and I'm gonna try to find one that's in better shape than this. This is real cloudy and hazy on the top side, so that's close to being gone. But I'm just gonna take that, and I'm going to plug it in here. And I'll twist it righty-tighty and get it set in there, and then I'll put the battery back on, and I'll flip the ignition and see if that choke light comes on or not. So that's what we're gonna do for now. Here's what we did. I've got the gauge sitting in here, so I'm pretty sure what I told you I was going to do. I made one mistake. The one that I told you was the check engine light was actually the four-wheel drive light on the left-hand side over here. That was still the choke, but all I did, I took one of those little twist out lights that I was telling you about. I took it out of the fasten seatbelt side. It's over here. I didn't think that was too important. I took that out of there. I put it in the choke hole, the little slot, and I hooked up the rest of the electrical, and now the battery's reconnected. I'm gonna put the key in, and we're gonna turn it to ignition, and now we have the choke light. So come over here, and I'm gonna show you what I did in the engine bay just to check it, because the light is one part, which is what we were missing, is why it wasn't working, but it's not necessarily everything. Just because the light comes on, that doesn't mean you're out of the woods. I have a multimeter hooked up here, and I've got my negative hooked up to the negative on the battery, because remember I said the negative on my choke is no good. It's hooked up to it, grounding out on an aluminum intake. The positive side, this is the choke wire coming from my engine harness. I've got that alligator clipped onto the positive of the choke, and then, or the positive for the multimeter, and the negative hooked to the battery, like I said. So I'm gonna go flip the key, and you're gonna see this show the voltage, basically 12, 14, whatever it should be coming from the battery. So I'm gonna turn it to ignition, and you're gonna see that come on. See it?
Yes.
Okay. So basically, that was our issue with the choke not working. It was two-part. Essentially, somebody removed the bulb at one point behind the dash, which is before your electric choke on these engines. So you have to have the bulb in there for that to make continuity and complete the circuit to send 12 volts to this terminal. Now, typically, electric chokes, the negative side grounds out on the carburetor, which bolts through the intake. On a stock intake, that's cast iron or metal, steel, and it grounds out right there. In this case, this is aluminum. It's an aftermarket intake. So all I gotta do now is run some sort of wire from the negative side of my choke to any ground, anywhere on the firewall, engine block, battery, it doesn't matter. I'm gonna run that wire now and put everything back together, and that should basically resolve all of our choke issues. And now I'll get back to working on the speedometer cable. real quick, before I jump into the rest of this and show you what's going on with the speedometer cable, that one is very straightforward. You know, you can pretty much see why it's not working, but the choke is a little bit different. I was never taught anything automobile wise. Pretty much everything you can find on the internet. I was laying in bed thinking about this, why it had a high idle. I thought it had something to do with the choke, and I just started looking stuff up. Then I put it together in my head that the intake was aftermarket and it might be aluminum, so it may not be grounding. But the first Google search, I just looked up high idle electric choke, and the first Google search was a thread talking about the light bulb in the dash for choke not being hooked up and that causing a high idle. So all this stuff, you can figure pretty much anything out online. I really don't know anything before I jump into this stuff. I was not ever taught anything automobile wise. I never grew up learning it. You can find everything on YouTube, on forums. That's why I make these videos, just to show people this kind of stuff, because it's a lot easier in a video to learn. But I don't have any formal training at all. I just play around with stuff until I figure it out. And you look stuff up, you eventually get something that kind of is in the ballpark, and then you figure out what it should be on your application. So that's all I wanted to say for now.